In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for member statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his prompting. We were caught in conversation. Mr Speaker, on indulgence, before the Parliament rises, as we indeed did, for our great Olympians, I want to share Australia's joy and pride in our Paralympians. There are still 3 more wonderful days ahead, and we are so proud of our team. They have shown discipline, focus, determination, dogged persistence, a great sense of humour, Mr Speaker, a great sense of the Australian spirit on display. We have witnessed the essence of what sport is all about, being the best you possibly can be. 60 medals, including 13 gold so far. Mr Speaker, these are Australia's newest gold medalists. Madison de Rosario, gold in the 800 metres, T53. James Turner, gold in the 400 metres, T36. In the cycling, Darren Hicks, gold in the 24-kilometre road time trial, C2. Amanda Reid, gold in the track 500 time trial, C1-3. Paige Greco, gold in the track 3,000-metre individual pursuit, C13. Emily Petricola, gold in the track 3,000-metre individual pursuit, C4. In the swimming, Rowan Crothers, gold in the 50 metres freestyle, S10. Ben Popham, gold in the 100-metre freestyle, S8. Lakeisha Lucky Patterson, gold in the 400-metre freestyle, S9. William Martin, gold in the men's 400-metre freestyle, S9. And the men's 4x100 freestyle relay, 34 points, including Matt Levy, Rowan Crothers, William Martin and Ben Popham. And in the table tennis, Australia's first gold medals in the sport for some 37 years. Lee Nei Lai, gold in the singles class 9, and Qin Yang, gold in the singles class 10. Mr Speaker, we have won 60 medals so far, and recognising the national significance of the Paralympic team, I'm very pleased to announce that the government will provide additional support to Paralympics Australia to ensure our Paralympic medalists will receive equivalent payments to our Olympic medalists, Mr Speaker. The Minister for Sport, at my request, spoke to Paralympics Australia CEO Lynn Anderson earlier today, and I'm delighted we've been able to support our fantastic Paralympians in this way. And I thank Lynn for the great work that she does with our Paralympic team and the way we've worked together on this, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, our Paralympians are wonderful and powerful role models. Darren Hicks, who won gold and a silver in Tokyo, was a truck driver who had a terrible accident 7 years ago. And with the help of others, he rebuilt his life. Fighting back the tears, Darren said, "It's an absolute dream to hear the anthem." There's Curtis McGrath. Curtis served as a combat engineer in Afghanistan and in August 2012 lost his legs after an IED explosion. That same day he vowed, "You'll see me at the Paralympics." He kept his vow, winning gold at Rio, and he's been competing today, progressing through his heat to the semi-final. Australia is proud of Curtis, proud of his service, proud of his grit. So many others have inspired us. There was Grant Scooter Patterson's ecstatic reaction after winning a bronze medal in the swimming individual medley and achieving his childhood dream after missing out on the Rio Paralympic Games. We witnessed the incredible return of sprinter Isis Holt. Isis won 2 silver and a bronze medal in Rio. Isis is here from Canberra and took a 2-year break from the sport to focus on her studies, and she comes away from Tokyo with 2 more silver medals. Swimming silver medalist Ahmed Kelly. Until the age of 7, he lived in the Mother Teresa orphanage in Baghdad, along with his brother. He was adopted by a humanitarian worker. Like so many others, Ahmed made Australia his home. Ahmed loves Aussie rules, where he was given the nickname Nails because he's as tough as nails, Mr Speaker. And there's the youngest athlete on the team, 15-year-old Isabella Vincent. She won silver in the pool. As a 6-year-old, she was inspired by the great Australian Kurt Fearnley, who happens to have the same condition as her. Izzy and Kurt met not long before she was jetting off to Japan. She said, "They say you shouldn't meet your hero. They are wrong." Now Kurt says he is her #1 fan. Speaking of number one fans, I'm claiming membership of the Todd Hodgetts fan club, Mr Speaker, together with Peter Gutwin. Mr Speaker, how good is Todd Hodgetts? When he was asked about his technique and his motivation in the shot put circle, this is how he described it. I said, God and country, and I whacked it. Todd's planning all the way out to Brisbane 2032, Mr Speaker, and I'm going to be there to watch him. I will be there to watch him, Mr Speaker. And I have to give a shout-out to Dan Michel and his ramp assistant, Ash McClure. They won bronze in boccia. I've got that right, Mr Speaker. I'm glad Bahrain's not in the Olympics. Australia's first medal in this discipline in 25 years. Dan and Ash are from the Shire, Mr Speaker, and I'm a very proud local member for them. All our Paralympians are incredibly dedicated, but the dedication of Christine Dawes in athletics and Danny DeToro in table tennis is simply extraordinary. They are both competing in their 7th Paralympics. James Turner, Mr Speaker, who won gold in the men's 400-metre T36 race, explained why the Paralympics matter so much to all of us. He said, having a disability is defined as what you cannot do, but competing at the Paralympics is all about what you can do. I want to go out there, he said, and show what you can do instead of focusing on what you can't. And that's a great lesson for all of us, Mr Speaker, to everyone in the Paralympic movement and to all who organise these games, especially our great friends in Japan. I say thank you. I say thank you. It has been a great triumph and will continue to be in the days ahead. And to all our Paralympians, thank you so much for inspiring us. Congratulations on your tremendous efforts. I want to thank all of your families and your friends and your supporters and everybody you know has stood alongside you and helped you along your way. But they know, as well as I'm sure you do, that at the end of the day, it was you who made the choice as a Paralympian. It was you who decided to go forward. It was you who decided to commit and be determined to be where you have been over these magical few weeks. And you have inspired us, and we are grateful that you are one of us as Australians. There is still much to complete, and in the days ahead we continue to wish you all the best of luck.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. Well, it's safe to say that during what's a very challenging time for Australians, a common sentiment across our nation is thank goodness for the Tokyo Paralympics. This is the largest Australian team ever sent to a Paralympic Games overseas. 179 athletes who are supported by 168 staff and competing in 18 of the 22 sports. Now, at present, with 3 days to go, Australia is 8th on the medal tally, with 13 gold medals, 23 silver and 24 bronze. And more medals to come, we hope, over the next few days. Some of the performances so far have been nothing short of stunning. Australia's first gold medal at the Games was won by South Australian Paige Greco in the 3,000-metre individual women's pursuit. She didn't do it by halves. She broke the world record by 7 seconds in her heat. Then, because that wasn't enough apparently, she knocked another 2 seconds off that time during the next race. Her teammate, Emily Petricola, then went and saw to it that Australia had back-to-back gold medals. Swimming champion Will Martin, who has already won gold in the 400-metre freestyle and the 4x100-metre freestyle, just went and broke the world record in his 100-metre heat, a world record that was incidentally set by him. Once again, the great stories are not just laid out in gold. As COVID was hitting Sydney, swimmer Tiffany Thomas-Kane had just an hour to pack and leave. Her grandmother died after she left Australia, and Tiffany dedicated one of her bronze medals to her. We've seen our 37-year gold medal drought in Paralympic table tennis brought to an end by Lena Li and Quan Yang, who won their respective women's singles finals in Tokyo. For Yang, it was her first time representing Australia. That's certainly one way to debut for your country. It's been a time for drought breaking. Dan Michel won Australia's first medal in boccia in a quarter of a century. I can inform the Prime Minister that boccia is a version of bocce, the Italian game, for people to compete with mobility impairment. It's a game of great skill that I watched the other night. It's quite an extraordinary game of skill. And Dan said, I'm heaps excited with it. As are we, Dan, as are we. I say to every one of our Paralympians, you have done us all proud as a nation in Tokyo. You are performing magnificently as athletes, as human beings and as representatives of your country. You embody everything that is great about the Paralympics. And I want to take the opportunity as well to thank our friends in Japan for hosting the Games. Now, I know we'll all be cheering on Dylan Alcott tonight when he plays his quad singles final. He's in with a good chance of completing something that can only happen by definition every 4 years, a Golden Slam, winning all 4 majors and the Olympic singles gold in a single year. Let our hopes for him remind us just how much the Games are about dreams. In a trackside interview, wheelchair racer Sam Carter recalled watching the Paralympics as a 10-year-old boy. He said this, every time I show up at the village, it's like I get a mental high five from 10-year-old Sam. So I'll leave the final word to Sam, who has this advice for any 10-year-olds who are dreaming that same dream. And I quote, get out there. If you work hard, you can do it. It's totally within reach. They have the goodwill of every single Australian, including the goodwill of our entire parliament. Well done.
Questions without notice. The member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why has the Prime Minister failed Australian women and voted against Labor's amendments to implement key recommendations by Sex Discrimination Commissioner Kate Jenkins in the Respect at Work report?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the member for her question. And as the member will well recall, the government has provided a full response to the Respect at Work report. Our response to the Sex Discrimination Commission report set out our long-term commitment to preventing and addressing sexual harassment. It seeks also to build a new culture of respectful behaviour in Australian workplaces by agreeing to, in full, in part or in principle, or noting all 55 recommendations in the report, Mr Speaker. The Respect at Work bill implements recommendations, specifically 16, 20 to 22 and 29-30 from the report, in line with the government's commitments in the roadmap for respect that the Attorney-General and I outlined many, many months ago. The bill also clarifies the applicability of the Sex Discrimination Act to members of Parliament and judges, and makes key amendments that would immediately strengthen the overarching legal framework, Mr Speaker, with respect to sex discrimination and harassment. We've prioritised these reforms for immediate introduction, recognising that other, more complex reforms require further consideration and stakeholder consultation. A number of recommendations need to be carefully considered together because they fundamentally change the core function of the Australian Human Rights Commission. A number of the remaining recommendations were directed to state and territory governments, to independent agencies, to regulators and the private sector, recognising the whole of community approach taken by the Sex Discrimination Commissioner Kate Jenkins, who I again thank for her work. And work to implement and coordinate these responses is already underway through the intergovernmental meetings such as the National Cabinet, the meetings of Attorney-General, the Women's Safety Task Force and the Work and Health and Safety Ministers, Mr Speaker. At my initiation through the National Cabinet, requested all states and territories to provide their response to the Respect at Work report, which at that time, Mr Speaker, had not been done by state governments, but I welcome the fact that has now all been done by state governments, Mr Speaker, and they have come forward. And even now, Mr Speaker, as we speak, the Women's Safety Summit is underway with the roundtable discussions already proceeding right now, Mr Speaker, and progressing some of the most important issues that you could imagine in keeping women safe in our country, Mr Speaker. We are supporting that, particularly with $1.1 billion investment in women's safety through the 2021-2022 budget, which includes over $60 million implementing the roadmap for respect, Mr Speaker. Our government has delivered one of the most largest commitments to supporting the safety of women in our community, Mr Speaker, consistent consistent with the actions of previous governments under the roadmaps and national plans which have been developed, which started with Prime Minister Gillard and has been faithfully continued by our government in a bipartisan way.
The member for Barker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Australian families and businesses, including my electorate of Barker, want to be able to plan for their futures with confidence, free of the uncertainty and damage of widespread lockdowns. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how sticking to the national plan will safely achieve this goal in line with increasing vaccination rates?
The Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Barker for his question. And I know the member for Barker will be very pleased that in the state of South Australia, Premier Marshall is a strong supporter of the national plan. A very strong supporter of the national plan, Mr Speaker, because he knows that it enables Australians to plan for their future with confidence, as the member asks. That plan gives people that certainty to be able to look ahead. And in the member's electorate, which spans a vast array of business activities and producers' activities, having the certainty that the plan delivers is critically important to his constituents, and Premier Marshall understands that. The Premier of South Australia understands that support for the national plan is vital to the state's interests, so we can live with the virus and not live in fear of it, Mr Speaker, that we can live without lockdowns and that businesses and Australians shouldn't have to fear lockdowns in the future and have the certainty to be able to get on with their lives, Mr Speaker, and create the confidence that is necessary for them to invest and go forward. The national plan provides the safe path out. A safe path out based on the best possible medical and scientific advice and evidence, as demonstrated through the Doherty Institute, Mr Speaker, which means that we can go forward with confidence about the safety, as the member says. It's not just about opening up for the good of our economy and our well-being, Mr Speaker. It is the right thing to do in terms of the safety of Australians, and it is based on the best possible medical advice. And the South Australian government understands this because they're implementing the plan by being the state who put up their hand to do the home quarantine trials, so home quarantine can work right across Australia. In New South Wales, in Victoria, Mr Speaker, in Queensland and other states. I was discussing this with the Victorian Premier last night, the New South Wales Premier the night before, so people will be able to travel again. That Australians can return to Australia, Mr Speaker, who have been vaccinated. Australians who have been vaccinated can leave the country and return as they once could and have the opportunity of home quarantine, which is so important. And the vaccination rate, which is now 20 million doses and more, having been distributed and administered across the country, Mr Speaker, 60.5%. First dose for the population aged over 16 and around 80%, Mr Speaker, for the population aged over 50. And in South Australia, 35.5% on double dose and 53.7% on the first dose, Mr Speaker, and that is in a state, like the great state of Tasmania, that have low levels of COVID or zero levels of COVID, Mr Speaker, but yet their vaccination programs are forging ahead. And I thank the Premier of South Australia and I thank the Premier, Mr Speaker, of Tasmania for achieving those results. The Premier understands in South Australia that they cannot go forward without the national plan to get the workers they need, to get the advance they need, Mr Speaker, and the certainty that is required.
Has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. 8 days after the New South Wales outbreak began, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "I commend Premier Berejiklian for resisting going into a full lockdown. Since then, more than 23,000 people in New South Wales have been affected. There are now almost 1,000 people in hospital, including 160 in intensive care. Does the Prime Minister regret this comment?"
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, we've addressed that matter already in this place, and I draw the member's attention. I draw the Leader of the Labor Party's attention to the work that has been done, which has been tracking the outbreaks in Victoria versus the outbreak that has occurred in New South Wales. And, Mr Speaker, as the Delta variant hit, there were hopes, Mr Speaker. There were hopes that those lockdowns, whether they were implemented in, I think, 7 or 8 days, Mr Speaker, in New South Wales after the commencement of the outbreak in New South Wales, or even earlier by the Victorian government. And I remember the Premier of Victoria making those comments at the time. They wanted to avoid the circumstances which had occurred in New South Wales. But we now know we now know that the track of that outbreak in Victoria is going along the same path as it is in New South Wales. That is the nature of the Delta variant. The Leader of the Labor Party may seek, Mr Speaker, to ascribe all sorts of blame and these sorts of things, Mr Speaker. They may seek to do that, but, Mr Speaker, the Australian people know that the Delta variant of the COVID-19 pandemic is, Mr Speaker, it is voracious. And the Leader of the Labor Party may seek to score political points off a pandemic, Mr Speaker, but we will remain focused on our response. We will remain focused on delivering the national plan which provides the pathway out, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Labor Party may want to focus on negativity and blame. We are going to focus on delivering the COVID response, delivering the vaccines, 20 million doses having been delivered, Mr Speaker, which is going to liberate this country, liberate people from lockdowns. We're focused on that positive task. We're focused on the hope, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party focused, as usual, on negative politics and point scoring.
The member for Flynn.
Thank you. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison-Joyce government's national plan is ensuring the availability of critical workers to regional Australia now to support agricultural sector? How important is understanding timelines when making decisions?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question, and he understands, as a former fuel distributor, how important timeliness is, especially timeliness so you can get the proper products to the proper areas at the proper time for the delivery of all sorts of things, the manufacturing of food products, which is vitally important. And now, Mr Speaker, in Western Australia, it's time for the harvest. It's time for the harvest. We've got about 10 million tonnes of wheat that has to come off, in excess of 4 million tonnes of barley that has to come off. We have over 2 million tonnes of canola that has to come off, and this can't happen unless it has the appropriate workers. The appropriate workers must arrive there. And this morning we hear reports of them needing up to 600 farm workers. But currently the West Australian and Queensland are yet to sign on machinery drivers in the grain sector right now in the eastern states agreements to get these workers across, to bring these workers in. And it's all right having the rhetoric of keeping a place locked up, but circumstances arise that you have to get your economy going. And the economy of Western Australia and the agricultural economy of Western Australia are going to need these workers, and they're going to need the capacity of government to make the changes, so we can bring these people in. We can't just have the place locked up forever. It won't work that way. And it won't work that way because it's not just the fact that we won't get these crops off, but our major markets that these crops go to, one which is a key and crucial economic ally of Australia, Indonesia, they're also needing this product. And they'll be watching to see whether we can manage the capacity, because 80% of West Australia's wheat crop is exported, whether they can get that crop in. And it goes beyond that, Mr Speaker. It goes down the line to the other things that are produced from that, produced from agricultural products, such as reconstituted skim milk, milk solids, vegetable oil, glucose, fructose syrup, sugar, glucose syrup, and fat-reduced cocoa powder. And I know the member for Grainlab knows about these, because they are the ingredients of the Viennetta ice cream. The Viennetta ice cream. And he has nostalgic views about the Viennetta ice cream. He went to a shop the other day, had to buy one.
Say to the Deputy Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat, or at least cease talking for a second. There's no way what the Deputy Prime Minister is saying fits in with the substance of the question. He's tried, he's bent it as best he can, but it's not going to work.
Well, Mr Speaker, you've got to give me 10 out of 10 for trying, don't you? So,
I don't have to do anything, actually.
What is important is the honesty and the capacity for us to make sure that we're able to get that crop off We are going to be making sure we do it because we will be delivering on the plan to not only keep the people safe, but to keep our economy going.
The member for Newcastle.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Prime Minister. In the 6 weeks between now and when Parliament is due to meet next, the number of COVID patients in New South Wales intensive care units is expected to peak. Today, the Australian Medical Association warned Australia's hospital systems is unprepared for a sharp increase in critically ill patients. What extra resources will the Prime Minister give the nation's health system so it can cope?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for a question. In my discussions with the New South Wales Premier on these very issues, and I believe her public statements have also reflected the fact that they are understanding peaks of the emergency, I should say ICU need in New South Wales to be reached later in October. That's their most recent information. They are regularly modelling these issues to ensure that they are mapping their resources and their capacities against their expected demand. This is an important project that I've initiated through the Secretary of the Department of Health and the National Cabinet process. We're doing this right across the country. This is not a new item. This is something that is being done by the Secretary of the Department of Health, Mr Speaker, for many months. In fact, from the start of the pandemic, it has been the most regular matter that we have continued to investigate and review to ensure the system capacity, and that's why some $6 billion of additional resources has been provided to states and territories right across the country as part of our funding partnership with the states to co-share the burden, to co-share meeting the demand in and through the state public health systems to make sure they can meet the emerging demands. And that goes on top of the fact that public hospital services in all states and territories for funding has grown substantially from $13.3 billion to $25.5 billion, some 92%, Mr Speaker, since we came to government. Funding is projected to continue to grow under the current 20 to 25-year National Health Reform Agreement, providing $135.4 billion between 2020-21 and 2024-2025. And that began preparation in February 2020. Increased ICU capacity from 2,000 to 7,500 ventilated beds nationwide, invested in $30 billion in COVID health measures, which includes the $6 billion I've already referred to. That includes establishing telehealth, GP respiratory clinics to ease pressure on hospitals and state workforce, investing over $6 billion, as I said, directly in the state hospitals. There's the private hospital partnership, Mr Speaker, which provides a 100% contribution, integration of private hospitals with state and territory health systems to ensure over 30,000 hospital beds and the sector's 105,000 strong skilled workforce is available alongside the public health sector. And we established a testing system with over 32 million tests and now testing at over 200,000 a day. Mr Speaker, the government, the Commonwealth Government, every single time there's been these needs that have been highlighted, has stepped up, and we've supported our states and territories, and we've carried that load with them. 50-50, Mr Speaker, all the way. The planning continues because the pandemic continues to change. And the Secretary of Health, Professor Murphy, has been working with his colleagues consistently all throughout the pandemic to ensure that what is required is available, because the public health system is, of course, an important part of implementing the national plan.
And I call the member for Clark.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, Tasmania is very fortunate to be safe and not locked down. The problem is half the country is locked out, which is causing big problems for businesses reliant on visitors from Victoria, New South Wales and the ACT. No wonder sectors like tourism, hospitality, arts and transport are being hit hard. No wonder airport workers are being laid off, tumbleweeds blow through Salamanca Market and publicans are working second jobs to pay staff. Prime Minister, some federal government help has been forthcoming, but it's not enough. So will your government provide increased targeted support to businesses in Tasmania, similar to what is being provided to other jurisdictions?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for the question, and the Treasurer will add further to the answer, as he's done a sensational job working with all state treasurers to ensure we're delivering record levels of support, including in states that have not had to go through the significant lockdowns that we've seen in New South Wales and the ACT in Victoria, and from time to time in Queensland in South Australia. Indeed, Tasmania has done an outstanding job, and I commend Premier Gutwein for the great job he's been doing with his government throughout the COVID pandemic, Mr Speaker, and I'm pleased to advise the House that he's in much better health and will be returning to work soon. I understand he may be there already, Mr Speaker, and in my engagement with him over the last few days, and I thank members for their interest and concern in the Premier's well-being. But, Mr Speaker, what is the most important thing that can happen in Tasmania to ensure tourism businesses, to ensure orchards and other agricultural producers can access the workers that they need to progress their businesses, and for hospitality venues to get their staff back, and all of those things, Mr Speaker, is the support for the National Plan. And I want to thank Premier Gutwein for his support for the National Plan, despite there being very low levels of COVID and virtually no levels of COVID in Tasmania. He's been so supportive of the National Plan, Mr Speaker, and he's been particularly supportive because in Tasmania 60.9% of Tasmanians have had a first dose of the vaccine, and 43.7%, Mr Speaker, 43.7% of Tasmanians have had a second dose, and that is in a state that has got a low level of COVID, Mr Speaker. A state with such a low level of COVID, where there have been issues with hesitancy in states that have had low levels of COVID, where they feel perhaps the virus may not come to them, or in communities that are remote. But the fact is, in Tasmania, they've been rolling up their sleeves, and they've been doing a terrific job in ensuring that their vaccination program has maintained the pace and strength that it has. But I'll ask the Treasurer to add further.
The Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. He knows that the Morrison government has stood by the people of Tasmania since day one of this pandemic. Indeed, more than $2.8 billion has gone from the federal government to the people of Tasmania, helping to drive their unemployment rate down to 4.5% today. Now, Mr Speaker, we have partnered with the Gutwein government on a specific plan to support businesses in Tasmania with grants of up to $10,000. And I can confirm to the House that already 400 businesses in Tasmania across a range of sectors have received those grants of up to $10,000. And of course, in the budget this year, we forecast that it will continue to be challenging times across states and territories like in Tasmania as we seek to recover from COVID. And that's why we put in place in the budget a range of measures, whether it was the tax relief. We saw nearly $4 billion in the June quarter go to Australian households, including those in Tasmania, our infrastructure projects and a range of other support measures.
And I call the member for Menzies.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I ask the Treasurer if he could remind the House why it's vital for economic recovery that all states and territories stick to the National Plan as agreed, so that businesses and families can return to life after the COVID-19 pandemic. And I ask him, in addition, is he aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Menzies for his question and acknowledge his incredibly strong contribution over so many years to this place and to his electorate of Menzies, as somebody who's deeply committed to supporting his constituents through this very difficult time. And he has supported policies that we have driven from this side of the House that will see, for example, more than 20,000 businesses in the electorate of Menzies being eligible for the extended immediate expensing provisions, supporting that economic recovery. Now, the member for Menzies and others on this side of the House understand that the Australian economy faced the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression last year. Treasury thought that the unemployment rate could hit as high as 15%, that the economy could contract by as much as 20% or more in the June quarter. We responded with overwhelming economic support, and that has seen a very strong recovery in the back half of last year, strongest growth numbers in 50 years. And we've seen the unemployment rate today come down to 4.6%, the lowest in 12 years. Yesterday we had the June quarter national accounts, better than what the market was expecting at 9.6% through the year. And what was particularly pleasing was household consumption was up off the back of our tax cuts and the easing of restrictions. We saw strong business investment. In fact, for machinery and equipment, more than 20% up since last October's budget, the fastest rate of growth in that category in nearly 20 years. And housing investment, up on the basis of very important programs like Home Builder, Mr Speaker, that have helped create jobs in the construction industry. But we also know that the economy today, despite that strong economic rebound we saw in the back half of last year and the beginning of this year, that right now we face real challenges with our two largest states in lockdown. And that's why we're responding with a COVID disaster payment, $750 for hours of work that has been lost, as well as business support packages with every state and territory, small business loans that have also helped support small businesses through this difficult time. But we do know that the pathway to Australia's recovery is not through higher taxes but lower taxes, Mr Speaker, tax cuts that we have passed, while those opposite continue to support higher taxes. They took to the last election $387 billion of higher taxes, and now they pretend that they support our stage 3 tax cuts. The reality is, just like we're now seeing with JobKeeper, they're coming after small business, they're also coming after Australians with higher taxes.
And I call the member for Macarthur.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Intensive care at Liverpool Hospital is already beyond capacity, with COVID patients being sent to other hospitals as far away as Wollongong. There are extra ventilators, yes, but not enough ICU nurses to run them. Why is training and recruitment of additional intensive care nurses only happening now, 18 months into the pandemic?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I would respectfully correct the member for Macarthur. I respect his work in the community, but on this occasion he's wrong. The program for upskilling additional nurses began in February last year. Through that process, we have seen approximately 20,000 nurses who are skilled in ICU. We've seen many other nurses who've been brought back into the system. The approach for protecting and preserving and strengthening the hospital system was laid out last year in February in the Australian Health Sector Emergency Response Plan for Novel Coronavirus. We're assisting in 5 particular ways. One, of course, is in terms of the specific training of nurses, both the upskilling to ICU. That was commenced not just a year ago, 18 months ago. Secondly, in relation to that, we're also assisting with beds. Thirdly, with ventilators. Fourthly, with funding. And fifthly, with PPE. To run through those, the Private Hospitals Partnership Agreement, or what is known as the Private Hospitals Viability Guarantee, creates a national partnership. It brings 30,000 beds, 57,000 nurses, and it brings over 100,000 staff into partnership, which can be drawn upon by any of the states and territories. At this stage, New South Wales has activated that and has now has over 19 hospitals in partnership where they are able to draw upon beds, nursing staff, general staff, ICU availability, ventilator capacity. In addition to that, the Commonwealth is able to provide and has provided through the National Medical Stockpile gloves, gowns, goggles, surgical masks, N95 masks. So all of these, have been activated.
We'll just pause for a tick. That doesn't need to go all the way back to his seat, I don't think. Yeah, I'm coming to you. The member for Macarthur on a point of order.
I'm well aware that there
No, you just need to state
relevance.
Yes.
I'm well aware there's enough equipment, but they are desperately short of nursing staff.
Just ask the member for Macarthur to resume his seat. It's not a matter for debate. The minister was very relevant on that subject at the beginning of his answer, and the material he's now providing is providing further information on the topic. The minister has the call.
In addition to the training of nursing staff and the upskilling, particularly for ICU capacity, the provision of nursing staff through the private hospitals viability guarantee, which has already been activated within New South Wales, and then, of course, the provision of funding. $6 billion has been provided to the Australian public health system for public hospitals so far. New South Wales, $1.1 billion has been provided through that partnership. We are expecting another $1.4 billion. So, if you bring it all together, nursing staff, beds, ICU capacity, ventilation capacity, funding and PPE. These are all of the things which we are bringing on the basis of the plan which was developed 18 months ago, which is being continuously reviewed and which is being implemented at this moment.
The member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the Minister please outline to the House the importance of Australia's national plan and how sticking with the plan will support the health and the mental health of all Australians?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Moncrieff. She's been a passionate advocate for health in her electorate, and indeed I had the privilege of visiting the TRICARE aged care facility in Mermaid Beach with her. It was a facility which, amongst one of the maintenance staff, had a positive case. But because that facility had been double vaccinated, there was no transmission to any staff on the basis of the knowledge that I have. The facility put in place immediately all of the elements for preparation in case of a potential outbreak, and those residents were protected, and that was a model outbreak and response. More generally, when we look around the world, we know and we see again the ravages being brought by COVID-19. Over 725,000 cases in the last 24 hours and 23,000 lives lost recorded. So it is fundamental that we acknowledge as a House, as a Parliament, as representatives, that this global pandemic continues and has embedded itself as endemic in so many parts of the world. It will therefore be with the world for a long time to come. Against that background, the vaccination program is fundamental to the work that we are doing on top of all of the other protections which we put in place. 330,000 vaccinations in the last 24 hours, but critically, we have reached the 20 million dose milestone, as the Prime Minister has said. What that means also is that we have now passed over 60% of all eligible Australians 16+ with first doses. And what that means as well is that we are now 2 million Australians from having 70% of all eligible Australians vaccinated, and 4 million Australians from that 80% mark. And that means these things are within reach. We are doing our work. It opens up the national plan, and that is so fundamental to mental health. The reason we all know, whether it is a small business owner, whether it is an employee, whether it's a single parent, the notion of being locked at home, or a child unable to attend the playground, or a child unable to go to school, these things can have an impact in terms of anxiety and depression. And so the national plan is fundamental in two ways. It's fundamental in keeping us safe. The 80% target is globally a highly conservative target, but we can get there. We're on the cusp of achieving this. And at the same time, it is also fundamentally about hope so as families can be reunited, people can recommence their lives, and ultimately Australia can proceed safely but with a sense of open optimism.
The member for Fenner.
My question is to the Treasurer. New analysis shows the Morrison-Joyce government gave more than $300 million of JobKeeper to firms that tripled their revenues. Given the government is chasing pensioners to return welfare overpayments, why is the government letting these businesses keep millions of taxpayer dollars they clearly didn't need?
The Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, it's hard to work out the member for Fenner. 1 minute he's saying that he invented JobKeeper, and that he
Members
voted
on my
for
left.
JobKeeper. Now he is saying that he's criticising JobKeeper. The reality is that JobKeeper helped save our economy, Mr Speaker. It helped save our economy. And that the first 6 months of the program was based on an anticipated decline in turnover. And the reason why we took Treasury's advice on that key point was that because the economy was staring into an economic abyss. At that time, we saw that the economy could have unemployment at 15% or above. That means more than 2 million Australians. And we all remember those images of our fellow Australians lining up outside Centrelink, which were for many reminiscent of the Great Depression. And we responded with JobKeeper based on an anticipated decline in turnover. Then there was a review after 3 months, and it was recommended that we leave the anticipated decline for another 3 months before we move to an actual decline in turnover and a tiered system for the back half. But, Mr Speaker, what the honourable member fails to understand is that the great deal of uncertainty in the economy at that time meant that we gave businesses certainty. We gave businesses the ability to plan for their future. We gave businesses the opportunity to hang on to their staff. And that meant that the unemployment rate today is at 4.6%, a 12-year low. And you know what it was when we came to government? 5.7%. So we've been through a recession, and the unemployment rate today is lower than when we came to government. And we also know that we have avoided, through this recession, a scarring of the labour market which we saw in the 80s and 90s recessions, which would have meant hundreds of thousands of Australians who were long-term unemployed. And that has been avoided by the fact that the JobKeeper program provided that degree of certainty. Now, it was a well-targeted program, because in Treasury's review they found that the average decline in turnover in April was 37% for JobKeeper firms. But in non-JobKeeper firms, the decline in turnover was just 4%, Mr Speaker, just 4%. And it's been described as no less a figure than the Governor of the Reserve Bank as a remarkable program. And today, Professor Stephen Hamilton, a visiting fellow of Tax and Transfer Policy Institute at the ANU, writes the following in the AFR. At a time of great uncertainty, when underpinning confidence was key, it's not crazy to have opted for the cleanest, simplest scheme that gave business an ironclad guarantee of what they would receive.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government's investment in cutting-edge technology is equipping our Defence Force with the capability they need to keep Australians safe, especially with global uncertainty?
The Minister for Defence.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question and for her very significant support of the Australian Defence Force and the personnel who live in her electorate. Mr Speaker, the reality is for our country and for our region is that we are living at a very uncertain time. And over the coming years, and indeed over the coming decades, we do know that the Indo-Pacific, Mr Speaker, will be as uncertain as it was during the run-up to the Second World War. We are worried, Mr Speaker, about the situation in the Indo-Pacific at the moment, and that is why it's important for Australia to take the steps now to protect and defend and to keep safe our country. And we have invested significantly in the Australian Defence Force over the course of the last 8 years, and we will continue to do that, Mr Speaker. There's a lot of rebuilding taking place after the Labor Party had taken money from the Defence Force, and, Mr Speaker, we are putting more into personnel and into equipment. We are, Mr Speaker, putting $1 billion into the Sovereign Guided Weapons Enterprise, which boosts skills, jobs. It helps create Australia's sovereign defence capability, and it is a significant deterrence for people who might think, our detractors, our adversaries, who might think that Australia is a soft target. Mr Speaker, we are investing $15 billion over 10 years into Defence's cyber and information warfare capabilities. We know that that is critical in the era of grey zone warfare, and we know, Mr Speaker, that there are many companies, there are many institutions, including health institutions, that were targeted during the course of COVID, particularly last year, but again this year. The cyber attacks are prolific, and we need to make sure that we have significantly more invested into our defences and also our offensive capability. In the Australian Signals Directorate within the Australian Department of Defence, we have a world-leading agency. They work very closely with the NSA in the United States and other agencies to keep Australians safe, to keep our defence industry safe, to make sure that we keep families safe in our country, to keep those in small business safe. And, Mr Speaker, it doesn't stop there. We've also invested in a significant way to work with the United States to comprehensively develop the Precision Strike Missile, or referred to otherwise as PrSM, which is a surface-to-surface all-weather precision strike-guided missile which will be capable of destroying, neutralising and suppressing diverse targets at ranges from 70 to over 400 kilometres. So, Mr Speaker, we are managing the economy well. We're managing the budget as best we can in the circumstances, because we want to invest in those things, not only to help us get out of the lockdown as soon as possible, but also, of course, the safety and security of our country.
And I call the member for Perth.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister said ultimately everything is a state matter. Was it the states, or was it the Prime Minister who backed Clive Palmer's attempt to tear down the Western Australian border last year and expose West Australians to COVID? Can the Prime Minister confirm his support of Clive Palmer cost taxpayers $1 million, some of which went directly to Mr Palmer?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I've said previously, state borders are state matters, and the Commonwealth did not pursue that matter.
And I call the member for Ryan.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Next week is National Child Protection Week. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is backing our law enforcement agencies to tackle this evil crime of child sexual exploitation and keep Australians safe?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you, and I thank the member for Ryan for his question, and I thank him for representing me yesterday in Brisbane at the launch of a partnership between the NRL and Suncorp Stadium to promote a new campaign to fight child abuse, which will be aired during the NRL finals. Now, I thank everyone involved, and I hope that it can encourage a very important relationship and conversation about child sexual abuse and exploitation, because it is one of the most evil crimes imaginable. It's a crime that can cause lifetime suffering, and too often it goes unreported and unnoticed. And our government is serious about changing that. And that's why we established the world-leading Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation. Now, it's known as ACE, and it's spearheading both our law enforcement and our community awareness efforts, and it's making a real difference. Now, this morning I joined the team at ACE, along with Australian of the Year Grace Tame, to launch the Stop the Stigma campaign to encourage people to talk about the crime of child sexual abuse. Now, it's a tough conversation, but it's a conversation that we all need to have, especially in the coming week, which is National Child Protection Week. Now, I'm sure every Australian would be incredibly shocked to know that last financial year the ACE received over 22,000 reports of child sexual exploitation. That is over 60 a day. Yet research conducted by ACE just last year found that only half of Australian parents talk to their children about online safety. 50% of parents don't know what to do to keep their kids safe online, and only 3% are concerned about online grooming. Now, most parents believe that online child sexual exploitation is too repulsive to even think about. But it's important that we do talk about it, so parents are aware of the risks, particularly online. And just last week, the online predators were put on notice with the passage of new laws to give police more powers to identify and disrupt criminals and pedophiles hiding on the dark web. It's a further step in the right direction. Now, as a government, one of our most crucial jobs is ensuring that law enforcement and intelligence agencies have the tools that they need to combat crime wherever it exists, especially the evil crime of child sexual abuse. For everyone who is here in the chamber, I encourage you over the coming days and weeks to start the discussion about online child sexual abuse and to continue to do all that we can to make sure that we get rid of this hideous crime.
The Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
Briefly, Mr Speaker, I associate Labor with the comments of the Minister and congratulate her on her ongoing efforts that follow her predecessor. It is indeed an outstanding achievement to establish this centre of excellence. It is world's best practice and it has the full support of not just this chamber but all decent Australians.
The member for Macon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister said ultimately everything is a state matter. Is it the states or is it the Prime Minister who is responsible for quarantine? How many quarantine leagues from hotels built for tourists have there been?
The Prime Minister has the
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for his question. Since the 28th of March 2020, when mandatory quarantine commenced, that's when public health orders were put in place by the states, Mr Speaker, to support the decisions of the Commonwealth Government to close the borders. Over 434,000 people have arrived and we have detected and isolated over 4,200 COVID-19 cases. Now, Mr Speaker, in around half a dozen cases, there were breaches of those quarantines which led to breakouts in the community. Now, Mr Speaker, 434,000 people arriving. Now, Mr Speaker, what is extraordinary as a result of that program put in place, with the great support of our premiers and chief ministers in the states and territories, has been a system that has played a central role in saving over 30,000 lives. Because this has been one of the key differences between Australia and the rest of the world. Now, other countries have engaged in hotel quarantine, New Zealand most significantly, and they have had similar success and continue to run that program, as many others do, as I understand, in Taiwan and other places. Now, Mr Speaker, that has been a program that has been so essential to saving so many lives in this country. And now the quarantine challenge moves to a new place, because as we move into phase B and phase C of the plan, Mr Speaker, when Australians will travel who have been vaccinated and more Australians will come home, and we want the restraints on Australians coming home lifted, the answer is home quarantine. And the home quarantine trial that we initiated through the national plan with the South Australian government is going to see more Australians come home and more Australians resume their connection with people all around the world. We will see families reunited, particularly those in our multicultural communities right across this country who have carried the hardest and heaviest burden of that international travel ban, Mr Speaker. They will be reunited. They will be able to reconnect. And the home quarantine model, Mr Speaker, is one that we know is absolutely vital to the success of the national plan. And again, I want to thank Premier Marshall for being the one who put up his hand and said we are going to give that a go, because we know how important that is to the people in his state and important to the entire country. And so I remind this House that it has been Australia's great fortune to have been able to come through this COVID pandemic, to be able to isolate what those 4,200 cases were in hotel quarantine, each and any one of them, Mr Speaker, and particularly if all of them, as we saw in other countries, were able to go through this country, then we would have experienced the same death rates as the United Kingdom, as France, Spain and many other places.
Has concluded. And I call the member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications, Urban Infrastructure, Cities and the Arts. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is protecting Australians online?
The Minister for Communications.
Well, I do thank the member for Lindsay for her question. She is a strong champion of the right of Australians to have the protection of the rule of law online as well as offline. If you interact in the digital town square, you're entitled to expect those protections, much as when you interact with others in the physical town square. And that's been a principle that the Morrison government has been very strongly committed to, and we have acted on that principle consistently since our Liberal National Government first came to power in 2013. We established what was then known as the Children's E-Safety Commission, the first jurisdiction in the world to do that, and we've consistently increased the powers of the E-Safety Commissioner. We added a scheme to deal with abhorrent violent material following the appalling Christchurch mosque attack and the live streaming of over 50 murders, an absolutely horrific occurrence. And indeed we added other powers as well to the remit of the E-Safety Commissioner, and just recently we have passed through the Parliament a new, stronger Online Safety Act, consistent with a promise we took to the Australian people in the 2019 election. And what that means is that when those new powers of the E-Safety Commissioner come into force early next year, there will be a new adult cyber abuse scheme to deal with serious cyber abuse of adults. This is something that many people have been calling for, and it's going to make a real difference. There will be increases in the E-Safety Commissioner's powers when it comes to the cyberbullying of Australian children. And very importantly, there will be a new set of basic online safety expectations. This is a really important point here, that this Act establishes a new platform, a new framework for being clear to the digital platforms as to what the expectations of the Australian people are, given effect to through their national parliament. We're consulting on what are in those basic online safety expectations now, but we want to be very clear about the expectations of platforms on which Australians are interacting online. We expect you to maintain safety standards. In the words of the E-Safety Commissioner, we expect you to have a principle of safety by design. And so we are standing up for keeping Australians safe online through those measures, through reducing takedown periods from 48 hours to 24 hours. And we are backing those extra powers with strong extra resources. Indeed, we're committing over $125 million over the next 4 years to back the E-Safety Commissioner and her team in the important work she is doing. The Morrison government determined to keep Australians safe, and that includes a place where all of us spend many hours interacting with each other online.
And I call the member for Canberra.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister said ultimately everything is a state matter. Is it the states or is it the Prime Minister who has left First Nations people, including those living in Western New South Wales, unvaccinated and unprotected against COVID?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'll ask the Minister for Indigenous Australians to add further to my answer and thank him for the tremendous work that he and the Minister for Health and Aged Care have been doing, working particularly closely with the New South Wales Government. 2 nights ago I had the opportunity to speak to the Chief Health Officer and the Premier in New South Wales, where we were reviewing that program and what additional support was required, Mr Speaker, and to work that issue through. The question, as it was framed, Mr Speaker, like others that have been put here, once again just continues to seek to misrepresent matters in this place. But on the serious issue that is raised, Mr Speaker, I'll ask the Minister for Indigenous Australians to add further.
The Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As of yesterday, we had 38% of Indigenous Australians with their first dose and 21% with their second. Let me say right from the beginning, we provided vaccines to the ACCHOs in the last week of March this year so that they were prepared. We had a steering committee established to develop the vaccine program. When I look at the membership of that vaccine program, I see some outstanding Indigenous leaders: Dawn Casey, Professor James Ward, John Patterson, Jill Gallagher, Dr Mark Winnetong, Olga Havanen. All of them have been involved in framing the action that is needed on the ground. And that plan has involved
using the capacity of every avenue that can provide the levels of support. Massive coordinated efforts through Commonwealth and state governments, Aboriginal health services, the ADF, the flying doctors, GPs and pharmacists and local community groups. And I must admit that it's been challenging. What I noticed is the member for Barton and the member for Hindmarsh yesterday talked about the hesitancy being an issue. Today they put out a new press release saying it's not that, it's lack of information. So it's a backflip. Let me tell you, it's a combination of things, and we have to work to make sure that we put into place the programs that are needed. And it doesn't matter what you on the other side say. This is about protecting Indigenous Australians in Aboriginal communities right across.
Members on my left.
Let me also say, Amos—
The member for Oxley.
The member for Oxley, you're out of order in terms of saying something you know nothing about. Let me say, Amos from The Australian at least did the Chris Moulder. He knows the truth was out there and he went out and he found the truth. He talked to people on the ground. He listened and was well informed in the article he wrote, which is a reflection of the way in which we're working. Pat Turner is doing an outstanding job in making sure that the community is engaged. We will continue to achieve the levels we're striving for, but you're not helping with some of the comments you're making.
The member for McKellar.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the Minister please outline to the House how sticking to the national plan will support Australian manufacturers grow, create jobs and secure our economic recovery?
The Minister for Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question, for his support of manufacturers in his electorate and for managing to beam in today. It's good to have you back. There are nearly 100,000 businesses in our manufacturing sector, Mr Speaker, and they employ over 908,000 Australians. And absolutely central to our manufacturers' ability to survive through COVID and to prosper over the coming years on the other side of COVID is two things, and this is what the manufacturers are consistently telling me. There are two critical parts of their business that they absolutely need continuity of access to. They need access to their workforces to thrive and survive, and they need access to their markets. And what they're telling me is that manufacturing cannot cope with lockdowns forever. And there was some very important information that came out as part of the national accounts, or parallel to it, the Australian Industry Group's Australian Performance of Manufacturing Index. Now, that fell, as it was expected to, in August 21 to 51.6 points. And the way in which that index works is that anything that's over 50 is still indicating that manufacturing is growing and in the expansion phase. So that figure, whilst it fell, shows the remarkable ongoing resilience of manufacturing, but it also contains a warning. In fact, there's been 11 consecutive months where there's been expansion, notwithstanding COVID, of manufacturing. But while Australia-wide manufacturing activity is still right across Australia, on average in a growth phase, the sales and the productivity in New South Wales and Victoria in manufacturing have stalled, as we would expect them to, and both those states report an index below 50. So what we have is a clear warning in these figures that we must have a consistent, clear path charted out of lockdowns in New South Wales and Victoria, and if there's not such a clear path charted and adhered to, then the lockdowns in New South Wales and Victoria won't just damage manufacturing in those states, it will damage manufacturing right across Australia. What the Morrison government is providing is that clear, consistent, known pathway out, and we're also providing a plan on the other side to grow the businesses that have the greatest comparative advantages and capacity for growth. And I want to mention one of those businesses as part of our $1.5 billion worth of modern manufacturing strategy, and that's a great business in Tasmania who's recently received a $5 million grant under the Modern Manufacturing Initiative. They're in Elphinstone in Burnie. And what is that business doing? They are developing a range of Australian-made and manufactured battery vehicles and support vehicles for mining and underground mining. And so you can imagine the demand for those sort of vehicles to replace diesel, which is both dangerous and excessive in underground settings. So what we have is a clear plan out and a plan for the future.
The member for Werriwa.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister said ultimately everything is a state matter. Was it the states or the Prime Minister who said the number of patients in ICU is a measure of success? How many patients are in ICU today?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Again, the manner in which that question was asked by the member is again misrepresenting the context of the statement, Mr Speaker. But on the serious issue that is raised on the number of people in ICU, my advice is that the number is 184.
The member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Resources and Water. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison-Joyce government is sticking to the national plan and supporting the resource sector in taking advantage of increasing demand for Australian minerals as we safely reopen? And is the Minister aware of any alternative policy approaches?
The Minister for Resources and Water.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Cowper for his question? A former undercover police officer, but his support for the national plan is not undercover, Mr Speaker. In fact, he's been out talking about the vaccination that he received. Why did he get it? Because we owe it to each other. Because we owe it to each other. Fabulous member for Cowper for the people that he represents over there. But, Mr Speaker, as economies around the world continue to open and recover from the pandemic, what we know is they'll invest in more infrastructure, and that infrastructure requires more resources, resources like iron ore, like coal, like gas, like critical minerals, whether it's gold or silver or lead or any of the things that Australia is well known for providing, Mr Speaker. They can get it from us. We are a reliable supplier. They can rely on us to deliver, and it will be necessary into the future. And sticking to the national plan ensures that we ensure the resources sector stays on track to continue doing what they've been doing now for over a year in terms of the COVID response, dealing with the pandemic and delivering for our economy, Mr Speaker. Now, what we've seen in the resources sector, they're forecast to earn some $334 billion for this country this financial year. And Mr Deputy Speaker, Tanya Constable, the CEO of Minerals Council Australia, has stated that minerals exploration investment has increased 14% to $3.2 billion in 2020-21. That is the highest spending since the peak of the mining boom in 2012. Now, Mr Speaker, over in the West, we know that there's been some research commissioned by independent labour market specialists for the Chamber of Minerals and Energy. And I'm not making this up, Mr Speaker. It is Pit Crew Consulting. That is PIT, Pit Crew, not PITT. The PITT Pit Crews in Bundaberg, Mr Speaker. And what they are saying is that there is expected to be a shortfall of some 33,000 workers by 2023. That includes things like geophysicists, geologists, maintenance and specialist engineers, civil engineers, electrical engineers. And, Mr Speaker, if premiers do not stick to the national plan, how does WA source those resources if they are limited to only their own state? So, Mr Speaker, it is incredibly important that we stick to the national plan, that we continue to deliver for our country. And, Mr Speaker, what we know is the national plan will help deliver confidence. And I come from small business. Business is about confidence. Confidence for investment, confidence for coming to our country, confidence for opening additional facilities, including mines. And, Mr Speaker, what we need to see is we need to see us united, and that includes those opposite. They should stop talking down our country, stop talking down our economy and get in behind the national plan, because the national plan will deliver confidence and investment and more jobs and more opportunities, Mr Speaker, right across this country. You cannot continue to fence off the rest of the nation if you need to fill jobs like these and deliver for our country.
Member for Whitlam. Well, it's just noise. I mean, I can't understand him. And, maybe if the advisor can pull his mask a bit tighter, that might help. The member for Bean.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister said ultimately everything is a state matter. Is it the states or is it the Prime Minister who is responsible for half the country being in lockdown because of his quarantine and vaccine failures?
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I reject the premise of the question completely, and therefore the answer is no.
The member for Robertson.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Education and Youth. Will the Minister update the House on how the National Plan will help get schools open so we can focus on lifting our school standards and give our students around the country the best start for their future?
The Minister for Education.
The member for Robertson for her question, and she knows the National Plan is absolutely critical to our society and economy, including for our schools, Mr Speaker. Because as we get to 70% of the population vaccinated, we're going to see fewer lockdowns and fewer restrictions for all people, including young people. And that means that we get to 70% of the eligible Australians vaccinated, and schools should be open, with closures limited only to hotspots areas. And a member for Robertson will know that her state of New South Wales, in fact, just today, hit 70% of the New South Wales population having their first jab, so that they're well on the way. And within a few weeks, they'll have 70% of the entire adult population with 2 vaccinations as well, Mr Speaker. Consistent with the National Plan, they've laid out their plans as to when schools in New South Wales can open, and I hope that the Victorian government will do something similar soon. So, Mr Speaker, that National Plan does provide that confidence, the certainty, the hope that schools can be open, can remain open, other than in absolute exceptional circumstances. And of course this is just so important, because in some cases, and particularly in my home state of Victoria, kids have now lost 29 weeks of face-to-face learning, and that can have devastating consequences for their learning, but equally can have devastating consequences for their mental health. Mr Speaker, when we finally get the schools back open, we start to get back to a normal state, then of course we must then have that laser-like focus on lifting educational standards so that kids can roar back towards the end of next year and into next year. And a key part of this is going to be in relation to the national curriculum. And in that curriculum, Mr Speaker, the revised curriculum which is underway, we want to see standards lifted. We want to see great practices embedded in that national curriculum, such as phonics. And of course, we want to see a positive and optimistic and patriotic view of our history embedded in the history curriculum. Mr Speaker, at the moment I'm very concerned about the current draft which the Curriculum Authority has put out. The current draft we would not support, and I've asked for further work to be done on that, because when you look at some of the standards, they go backwards in the current draft rather than forwards. When you look at the history curriculum, it has such a negative view of our history rather than a positive, patriotic, optimistic view of our history. Mr Speaker, this national plan gives us great hope and confidence. It gives us the hope and confidence the schools can be open. We focus on educational standards to give us hope and confidence that kids can roar back, and together parents, teachers and kids can be very optimistic about the future.
I'll call the Chief Opposition Whip.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister said ultimately everything is a state matter. Was it the states or was it the Prime Minister who falsely claimed that Australia was at the forefront of the vaccine queue?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Again, the Labor Party in their questions misrepresent things, Mr Speaker. They simply misrepresent things. This is something I've become very familiar with over the course of the last 18 months. The government has focused strongly, Mr Speaker, on delivering our national plan, and that includes the fact that 20 million doses of that vaccine has been administered in this country, even just this week. 500,000 additional doses, Mr Speaker, secured from Singapore. That's on top of the more than 1 million doses that we're able to secure from our arrangement with Poland, Mr Speaker, and I can assure you there are more irons in the fire here, Mr Speaker, which means we will be able to continue to support the vaccination rates that we're seeing that fuel, Mr Speaker, that support the national plan that enables our country to live with this virus, not live in fear of it, Mr Speaker, to live without lockdowns nor in fear of lockdowns, Mr Speaker, so businesses can plan with confidence, so Australians can come together again and connect with the rest of the world, Australians can travel again, the workers we need to reap the harvest, Mr Speaker, and work in the mines and wherever they are across this country. That's what the national plan delivers. That's what our government, Mr Speaker, has been focused on. By contrast, we get the negativity and the undermining, Mr Speaker, of an opposition that only knows that way and provides no hope or no plan, Mr Speaker. By contrast, the Australian people can have confidence that our national plan will see them, Mr Speaker, go forward, our economy move forward, Mr Speaker, to defy the negativity and the undermining of those who would seek for Australia to fail, Mr Speaker. Under our government, Mr Speaker, our country will succeed. And we're inspired by those Paralympians as well, Mr Speaker, who show us the way, of optimism and hope, Mr Speaker. The hope stealers of those opposite, Mr Speaker, will be dismissed, and the Australian people will continue to support the optimistic and positive plan that our government has put in place.
The member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment, representing the Minister for Women. Next week's Women's Safety Summit will inform the national plan to end violence against women and their children. Will the Minister outline to the House how this crucial work involving leading experts, frontline workers, counsellors and survivors will help achieve real outcomes to improve the safety of women and children across Australia?
The Minister representing the Minister for Women.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Bass for her question? She has a deep personal interest in and a commitment to the safety of women and their children. She talked about this in her first speech. She works hard for change. I know she's continuing her own series of roundtables with women's safety advocates, and I want to assure her that what they say and what she says will be listened to by this government. I want to take the opportunity to thank the frontline workers, those who provide crisis accommodation, emergency management and support through the challenging road to justice for women and their families. We know the work you do under harrowing circumstances is vital, especially through the pandemic, in circumstances that change every day. We cannot stray from our goal to stop it at the start, to work towards zero, so that all women and children can live a life free from the threat of physical violence and abuse in all its forms. And we also recognise, Mr Speaker, that as we work towards that goal, we want to provide sustainable, holistic support for women and their children. And that's why the Women's Safety Summit is an opportunity to continue the conversations, to listen to the experts, to listen to the concerns of particular communities right across Australia, rural and regional, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, recently arrived migrants, to understand the challenges facing older women, to understand how we can improve police and justice responses, to look at economic and housing security, safety in the workplace. And I was able to participate earlier today in one of the roundtable consultation sessions, and I look forward to the insights gained from the summit. I encourage all members to tune into the summit online at womensafetysummit.com.au on Monday and Tuesday of next week. The submission process is available until September the 15th. The summit and the consultation on the next national plan will help lay out the roadmap towards zero. And this, of course, is being supported by the single largest ever investment by a government in women's safety, $1.1 billion. That's just our down payment on the next national plan. So we've invested $64 million in the last budget implementing the roadmap for Respect, and today the Respect at Work Amendment Bill passed the Parliament, and I welcome its passing because we care and we respond to women's safety in the workplace. Everyone deserves safety. The crucial work being undertaken by so many will reach a new milestone at the Women's Safety Summit, and I look forward to the summit commencing and updating the Parliament on its outcomes.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper, and I wish the Women's Safety Summit all the very best, Mr Speaker.
We've got a few just things to get through quickly before the MPI. The Leader of the House.
Thank you very much.
Papers in for the motion you have.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Documents are tabled in accordance with the list circulated to honourable members earlier today. Full details of the documents will be recorded in the votes and proceedings.
The Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I move that leave of absence be given to every member of the House of Representatives from the determination of this sitting of the House to the date of its next sitting.
Question is the motion moved by the Leader of the House be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I move that leave of absence from the 18th of October to the 28th of October 2021 be given to the honourable member for Blaxland for parental leave purposes. Mr Speaker, just briefly, for the member for Blaxland and to Jason's wife Louise are expecting another baby boy in coming weeks to join young Jack. And on behalf of the Australian Labor Party, and I'm sure on behalf of the entire House, we congratulate them in advance. Jason is online watching this at the moment, and wish Louise all the best as well for the birth. We are having a baby boom on this side of the chamber, Mr Speaker. There's no doubt about that, and it augurs well for the Labor primary vote in 2039. And by then, Mr Speaker, myself and the then Leader of the Opposition might be ready to leave.
Question is that the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. We'll move to the matter of public importance. I've received a letter from the Honourable